Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We'll take this from...
Another round of applause, please, for Beverly. Kicking off this inaugural event at the Speaker Series. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you. And Beverly, I have to say that your husband, Adrian, he sounds like a wonderful man, but as I was hearing you describe his story, it was one that was familiar to me. It reminded me of the journey of my own parents who came to this country 40 years ago with no money. In a single generation, they came to Cincinnati, Ohio, is where I grew up. In a single generation, I've now gone on to found multiple successful companies, married my own wife, Apurva, who herself has lived the American dream as the kid of immigrants who came legally. She's a throat surgeon at Ohio State. Now where we raise our two sons, teaching them to appreciate and love that American dream themselves. And so that speaks to me. And particularly his story even as a chemist, somebody who was an innovator, somebody who was a pioneer, reminds me of actually even this great tradition we've had in our country for years of the likes of great scientists who have sought to do their work in the United States of America because they could pursue truth without anybody standing in their way. The first example of that was actually Joseph Priestley, who came here shortly after around the time of the American founding. He was welcomed by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin because he had certain beliefs that fell outside of the mainstream Anglican thought, and he couldn't safely pursue his own beliefs in England. Actually, he was under threat. He came to the United States as a chemist. I didn't plan to talk about this, but I heard you talking about Adrian and his background as a chemist. He actually continues a great tradition that goes back to the founding of this country all the way to the moment where Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson welcomed Joseph Priestley to the state of Pennsylvania. I'll tell you, that American dream, I would love to tell you it's alive and well today. I was talking to a few students beforehand. But it's really not. It is alive and hanging on for life support. And that's what I want to talk about today is what is that American dream? My parents, after they came here, they raised us with not much in Cincinnati, Ohio. And last year I went on to become, just 37 short years later, the youngest person in U.S. history to run for president as a Republican. And I would say that I've achieved many great things that I'm proud of in my life, but the one I'm most proud of is that by the end of the campaign, most people in the country were actually able to pronounce my name correctly, which is, as you did, Beverly, thank you for saying it correctly. It's Vivek like cake and Ramaswamy like Ramaswamy, as I like to say. So there's only one way to say that one. But I got a question that I don't often get a chance to answer, which is, what does your name mean, or what is the root of your name? So Vivek is derived from a Sanskrit word that actually stands. It doesn't translate directly. If you translated it literally, it means the ability to discriminate or to discern. But it really stands for wisdom. That would be the Sanskrit word for Vivek is the Sanskrit word for wisdom. And it actually spoke to me, being here, understanding the motto of this university as well, Sapientia e Scientia, knowledge and wisdom. And that's what we're here to talk about today. It was a special occasion for me to come here to talk about the subject of the pursuit of truth and what's the backbone of how we actually do it. The American way is that we do it through free speech and open debate without any idea or any other censorship stopping what ideas we can express. That's what made this country great the first time around. You'll hear a lot these days about the threats to our democracy. And I ponder this from time to time. What is the real strength of our democracy? Is it the number of green pieces of paper in our bank account? Is it the number of ballots we cast every November? These things are important, but if you ask me the best measure of the health of our democracy, it's the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And right now, there's no doubt that we're doing poorly on that metric. There's a culture of fear that has spread across this country like an epidemic. Fear of losing your job. Fear of your kids getting a bad grade in school. Fear of becoming an outcast in your own community. And that culture of fear has really replaced our culture of free speech and open debate in America. And I think the way we're going to get this country back is by all of us starting to actually speak our minds in the open again. Say in public what you will say in private at the dinner table. Say it with a spine. Say it with conviction, and say it with respect. But part of respect is that you respect your neighbor and your friend enough to tell them what you actually think. not some fake whitewashed or woke-washed version of it, but the actual belief that you have in your heart. And as long as your friend gets to do the same in return, that's what made America great the first time around. Beverly, I hope you don't mind me sharing, but even you were discussing beforehand, you're sitting next to your daughter and other family members of yours, how you have diverse views in your own family. Great, I do too. Most of us do in this country. And I think part of what we've lost in America is the ability to see, even as we may disagree deeply with an ideology, to recognize that our enemy is not our fellow citizen. Our enemy may be an ideology that we're up against. But the way we're going to get our country back is all of us being able to disagree wildly, but still get together at the dinner table at the end of it. And that's the core premise behind the book that I published this year. It's called Truths, The Future of America First. What is that future? I reflected on my favorite moments from the presidential campaign. And there were some moments that were very contentious. I had one particular exchange with Don Lemon. I remember this. It was at the start of the campaign. He was an anchor at CNN, for those who may have understandably forgotten, who he was. But he was they invited me to on the show, presumably to hear my opinions. But as I started to share some aspects of U.S. history that made him uncomfortable relating to what happened after the Reconstruction era, the claim I made was that black Americans only gained their actual autonomy and civil rights after they won their Second Amendment rights. And I think that's a proven fact of history. But he really took issue with this and effectively told me that I couldn't disagree with him until my shade of melanin was the same as his, when your skin is as black as mine. The irony is, actually, I looked at the video afterwards, and our shades of melanin are actually strikingly similar. But I take the spirit of his point to be whatever it was, details to one side. And, I told him that America's not a country that dictates what you can say based on the color of your skin. The content of your character is what matters. And, CNN had a choice to make. They had new leadership at the time. Was this going to be a network that was pushing one-sided political ideologies? Or was it a network that actually wanted to platform multiple different points of view? And so the CEO made the decision that Don Lemon's behavior apparently didn't necessarily, in that interview or others, comport with the values of their network. I can only presume that was behind their decision to eventually fire him about a week later after I had gone on, only to later then discover that CEO got fired after making that decision. But I had those kinds of moments during the campaign that were really contentious, that involved high-stakes controversy with the media, with those on the left who may have disagreed with me. But those weren't my favorite moments in the campaign, actually. My favorite moments were actually in settings like these, where we often had protesters that walked into the event. And in one case, I remember I was in Ottumwa, Iowa. There was a woman who came in. It was like the equivalent of the back of that room. She was screaming from the back. Initially, I thought it was a fan. She was screaming so loudly. I thought it was a boisterous fan. But then I quickly realized that she did not agree with what I had to say. In this case, she didn't agree with my pro-life views. And, I'm pro-life as a product of my faith. I'm Hindu, but I was educated at St. X High School in Cincinnati, which affirmed my faith-based reason for being pro-life. She disagreed with me. But she came into the room, and she was screaming. It was like the police, the equivalent of our security here, was ready to take her out. They were escorting her out. And there was something about it that felt wrong to me, to say there was somebody here who came to be heard. She wanted to share something. You couldn't quite hear it because she didn't have the microphone, but she was really screaming at the top of her lungs from the back. She was about to go out the back of the room, and I told the security, bring her back. We're actually going to hear what this woman has to say. And she shared her story, which was actually one where she opted for life, not for abortion. And she was a single mother of a daughter who she had some trouble raising, making ends meet economically. She shared her story, and at the end of it, I shared with her that regardless of our political beliefs or disagreements, she was actually doing perhaps one of the most important things that we could be doing in our country right now, which is bringing up children in our country that is lacking in our fertility rate, that's lacking in parents who are giving love to their children, especially as a single parent. And she broke down. She was in tears at the end of it, and the audience applauded her for her story and welcomed her, even though the majority of the people in that room, like me, were pro-life and may have disagreed with her pro-choice perspective. It turned out that became a pattern over the course of the campaign. We had a number of people who disagreed with my views on the transgender debates. I shared a perspective that gained some controversy over the course of last year, which is that if a kid says their gender doesn't match their biological sex, it was and remains my view that that is usually evidence of a mental health condition. But the right answer in that situation isn't to affirm that kid's confusion. That's not compassion, that's cruelty. Well, we had a number of people who really took issue with that view and interrupted a number of my events. But the way it was reported by the press is Vivek is against LGBTQ rights, whatever that means. There was a woman who was at a bar in Iowa. It's the way you run a presidential campaign, actually, is about a few thousand people in Iowa get to decide, who ends up being the eventual presidential nominee. And it's actually a beautiful system. There's a lot to like about it because it allows for these intimate interactions. But there was an event at this bar in southwest Iowa, I remember it vividly, where there was mostly a friendly audience, but she was kind of a heckler in the back. She had short-cut hair, and she was wearing jeans, and she would kind of heckle me over the course of the speech. And I said, okay, I'm going to open this up to Q&A. I'm going to finish the speech, but after I speak, you get to speak, and we're going to hear you as long as you're respectful to everybody else and hear what they have to say. She said, fine. So I gave her the microphone, and she shared with me, she said, I'm a lesbian. You're against my way of life. Your words are an affront to me. I've served this country in the military, and I disagree with where you stand on the view of LGBTQ rights. And I began to explain to her, look, I draw a distinction between adults and kids. Kids aren't the same as adults. Do you agree with me? She said, yes, kids aren't the same as adults. Well, I shared with her my view that as a fully grown adult, you're free to identify how you want, name yourself how you want. As long as you're not hurting somebody else, it's your decision as a fully grown adult to make a decision about how you want to identify yourself. But kids aren't the same as adults. And my only caveat for adults, by the way, is this, too, is you can identify how you want, but that doesn't mean that men should be able to compete and win trophies in women's sports competitions. And she said, wait, what did you just say? I said that men should not be free to just compete in women's sports competitions because then we wouldn't have women's sports. And she said, well, hold on a second. I actually agree with you on that one. I said, okay, well, we found some common ground here. We ended up getting a drink at the bar afterwards, and it turns out that we had common views on the way the U.S. VA is failing to actually take care of our veterans, which turns out to be another situation that she was suffering from herself. And so one of the things I learned from this extraordinary journey, actually, of running for president, I managed to get 8% at the Iowa caucus, which is more than people expected of me, but wasn't enough to win the presidency. As a first-timer, people said, you started at 0%. I corrected them and said, I didn't start at 0%. I started at 0.0%, to be precise. And, in the course of 11 months, was able to beat multiple governors and senators and a former vice president, which I think speaks less about me and more about what's possible in this country. But anyway, it wasn't enough to win the presidency, but to earn that 8% of the Iowa caucus, I probably had tens of thousands of individualized conversations like the two that I just described. Both of those were in Iowa alone. And what I learned is that, first of all, I'll say a few things. One is that we're not nearly as divided as a country as we're taught to believe. Right? This myth of national division, it's almost become part of our self-conception as a nation, that we're deeply divided. I thought that at the time I started my campaign. I can now tell you affirmatively from my own experience, and when I say tens of thousands of individual conversations, I'm not exaggerating that. Tens of thousands of people over the course of a year. It impacts you. And there's one way you could approach that. One would be by having sort of a standard stock answer that you're pulling off a shelf that you bring to each of those individual conversations. But the far more tiresome yet more meaningful way to do it is if you really go through treating each of those individual conversations as a unique interaction, boy, do those tens of thousands of interactions really change you as a person. What I learned through that, and I have deep conviction in today, is that we're not really as divided as the media or the social media algorithmification of our interactions would suggest. I think 80% of us in this country, easily 80+% of us in this country, share the same national values in common. And I would further posit that half the 20% on the other side are people basically younger than me who never learned those ideals in the first place. They're with us too. So what's actually going on is we've created this myth of national division, which I think has some commercial benefits to the people who perpetuate that division, not the least of which is the media marketplace in which we live today. That was the first thing I learned. But the second thing I learned is that there are just some questions. You could pick your hottest button issues. Abortion is on that list. You could probably pick some element of this transgender or LGBTQ culture debate on this list. Probably even climate policy, which I can talk about a little later. There's a few of these issues where I'm convinced that
We won't find 100% common ground because they're mutually exclusive choices that need to be made. So how is it possible to find national unity in the face of those divisions? One of the things I learned is it's by actually going to the other areas. We're going to agree to disagree here, but still go to the other areas where most of us still end up agreeing. So you and I may disagree on whether we're pro-life or pro-choice, or whether an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old should be able to undergo genital mutilation and chemical castration. But we're going to leave that over there, and we're going to go over here and just ask ourselves, do we agree on a principle like merit? The idea that the best person gets the job, regardless of their skin color. That you get ahead in this country not in the color of your skin, but on the content of your character and your contributions. I think actually most of us tend to agree on that. Do you agree that you get to speak your mind openly and express any opinion, whatever it is, no matter how heinous I may find that opinion, that you have the right to express that opinion as long as I get to in return? I think most of us agree on that. Do we agree on, and this one's a big one for the next few years, do we agree the people we elect to run the government, whether I agree with them or not, the people we elect to run the government should be the ones who actually run the government, as opposed to unelected bureaucrats who were never elected to that position? I think most people, Democrat or Republican, agree with that basic principle of self-governance. I say this as the kid of legal immigrants. Do we believe in the rule of law? And does that mean that if your first act of entering this country breaks the law, that means that you actually still broke the law and we have to enforce it? I think most of us in this country actually agree on those basic rules of the road. My immigration policy perspective sometimes got controversial on the campaign. I start with a few basic principles. No migration without consent. Consent should only be granted to migrants who benefit America, and those who enter without consent must be removed. I actually think most Americans have just formulated as such. Start talking about mass deportations right off the bat, people might have a different view. But if you go with those basic principles, no migration, like your body is a nation and your nation is a body, no migration without consent, consent should only be granted to migrants who benefit America, and those who enter without consent must be removed. And I will take that as a voice of affirmation right there from the next generation. I actually think most of us tend to agree on these basic rules of the road, and that's a beautiful thing. So why this myth? Or what is the vested interest in this myth of national division? What is it preying on, actually? I think it's preying on a deep psychic insecurity in our country. And this is what I'd like to close this section with before I open this to Q&A, where I'd like to spend most of our time. I think what's going on actually is that we are suffering from perhaps the greatest loss of self-confidence in our country that we have encountered probably since the Civil War. And I'm not saying that as a matter of hyperbole. I think since about 1864, this is, in 2024, the greatest crisis of national self-confidence in the United States of America that we see. Gen Z, less than 16% of Gen Z says they're proud to be an American. We have a 25% recruitment deficit in our own U.S. military. This comes at a moment where we see a rise in depression, anxiety, a mental health epidemic spreading faster than COVID-19 in the United States of America. What's going on there, actually? I think there's a deeper deficit. A lot of our national division, a lot of the rise of these secular trends, from wokeism to transgender ideology to climate ideology to even, frankly, the COVIDism of policies of a few years ago. I think these are all symptoms of a deeper void in our country, a symptom of a void of purpose and meaning and identity at a time in our national history when the things that used to fill that void, faith in God, patriotism, hard work, family, these things have disappeared. And when you have a black hole in your heart that runs that deep, that's when the poison fills the void. And sometimes we make this mistake. I say we maybe in the conservative movement, I say we, referring not to other people I'm blaming, but even myself. We make this mistake of focusing on the poison, playing a game of whack-a-mole. You got some wokeism over here. Well, don't worry. We got some anti-Semitism over here. We got that down. And climate ideology, we'll slap that down. It's a losing game unless we actually fill that void with the real thing. There's an old expression from Blaise Pascal, who, like Adrian, like my parents, was also a famous scientist, in his case over 400 years ago, who famously said that if you have a hole the size of God in your heart and God does not fill it, something else will instead. in the civic sphere, you would say if you don't pledge allegiance to the American flag, you're going to pledge allegiance to a different flag instead. It's wired in us. There's something about us as human beings that we want to bend the knee to something bigger than ourselves. We're all hungry to be part of something bigger. Yet today we live in a moment where we can't even properly answer what it means to be an American. What does it mean to be an American in the year 2024? I think we lack a good answer to that question, but we needn't. We don't need to reinvent it. I just think we need to revive the ideals that set the country into motion the first time around back in 1776. And if we fill that vacuum with the real thing, a real vision of our national identity, a real revival of faith in God, not a four-letter word, I don't think it should be. Revive grounding in the family, that I'm the son of two parents, a mother and father who brought me into the world, that means something, that is true, that is real, that I'm a citizen of this nation, the United States of America, not some nebulous global citizen fighting climate change somewhere, but a citizen of the greatest nation known to mankind. And that is a part of my identity, that I work hard, get ahead, riding not some tectonic plate of group identity based on my genetics, but that you are an agent endowed by your Creator with your own unique skills that you can use to achieve the maximum of your God-given potential without anybody standing in your way. Revive that self-confidence that we lack. Then I think our other problems melt away as a consequence. I think our economic problems mostly melt away, where the input to the success of an economy is actually self-confidence, to be able to take risk and create things that don't otherwise exist. The ability to be a nation that stands for the rule of law has to believe in its own legitimacy to enforce those laws. The threat to self-governance is a skepticism that we, the people, could self-govern, so we had to give it to Anthony Fauci's and three-letter bureaucrats agencies to be able to do it instead. I think if we revive that missing self-confidence in our country, then our best days are actually still going to be ahead of us. Not in some, fake kumbaya, cheesy politician way, but in a true way. I actually believe that our best days as the United States of America can still be ahead of us, that we still are on our way to that shining city on a hill, that country where we will look our kids in the eye and mean it when we tell them, you get ahead in the United States of America with your own hard work, your own commitment, your own dedication, and that you know what? You are free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream. That is what we are running to. And with your help and with the confidence of the next generation behind us, that is how we will actually make America great again. So thank you all for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to just introduce the topic, and we'll open this up to Q&A before we wrap this up. Thank you, Beverly, for the warm welcome. I'm told they have some microphones. I think I actually see a couple here. So don't be shy, and let's no better way to be heard than to speak your mind freely and openly. We'll start with the gentleman who's coming up on this side, and then we'll come to you right afterwards.
Thank you for letting me ask a question. Something has bothered me, maybe all my life. What is the truth when somebody deliberately speaks a lie, and now when we hear a politician speak, we have something called fact check? What are you deliberately lying and having somebody try to catch you? Where has our politics gone so low that lying is acceptable? Speaking untruths about other people, about our economy, about the nature of the world.
Yeah.
The truth is the truth, and I just have such a problem with what politicians seem to be about today. You're self-excluded.
Thank you.
I admire you greatly. But the truth is the truth, and it doesn't seem to be adequate today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the earnest question. And I don't think this is going to provide you comfort, but the only thing I would sort of pick at in your formulation is it's not unique to today.
It's actually always been this way, and so maybe that should make us feel a little bit better. Even if you go back to our founding fathers, the mud they were slinging at each other. I mean, the rivalry between Jefferson and John Adams, and then Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. I mean, even the libelous stuff they spread about one another. It actually makes the hush money payments to porn stars seem very PG by comparison, okay, compared to what they were swirling around back then. And so I think that in some ways people have been having this conversation for time immemorial. I think what's unique about the moment we live in today is that we have the algorithmic amplification of a set of views that we feel like we're in control of, but we're not actually. And so my own view is the path to truth, I said in the beginning, I'll say it now, runs through more speech, not less. Runs through free speech and open debate. But that only works if you have a true, honest, open marketplace of ideas. It doesn't work if you have centralized arbiters of truth that determine what the public can and can't see. I'll give you a few examples. In the year 2020, if you posted on social media or even sent a private direct message in certain cases that COVID began in a lab in China, you would have been censored, you would have been silenced, you had Facebook posts that were taken down, YouTube videos that were removed, and you would have also been dismissed even culturally as a racist or a xenophobe. The fact of the matter is, if we, for all we know right now, we know that COVID in all likelihood began in a lab in Wuhan, and yet we got to that answer later because we suppressed people's ability to express it. Go straight down the list with respect to lockdown policies. I don't think we would have locked down our schools nearly for as long as we did if we had been able to have the debate about those very lockdown policies. And yet, from YouTube to Facebook to Twitter, took down exactly the arguments that were against lockdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic. So history teaches us time and again that the guys who are looking to censor speech never end up on the right side of history in the end. So we might as well, next time around, learn that the answer to bad speech or wrong speech, I think the temptation may be to say that, well, because people are lying, we've got to figure that out in advance, and how do we silence them? I look at it the other way. The answer to bad speech is always not less speech, it is more speech. Do so without censorship, have an open marketplace of ideas. That's the American way. It's worked for us for the first 250 years, and if we stay true to that principle, I am not worried that the truth eventually comes out. I say the truth is like a lion. Okay, you can only hold it back for so long, but eventually it's going to find its way out. Only if we preserve a censorship-free culture that allows that lion to actually get out of its cage. So, thank you. I appreciate that, my man. Great question. Thank you. We'll go right here. Thank you.
I just had a question about...
Yep, you can just go closer to the microphone and they'll hear you.
I wanted to ask if you believe that the integrity of your campaign might be compromised due to your father's citizenship status, or does that change any of your beliefs on the citizenship and migration laws that you speak about in your campaign?
It does not. And I think that the beauty of this country is I draw a distinction between legal and illegal entry into the country. Okay? And I think this is something that's true to the tradition of our country as well. Your first act of entering this country cannot break the law. And if you're crossing the border or sneaking in illegally or lying to the U.S. government about your asylum status, then that is a violation of the rule of law. And I think it's one of the things that both the left and the right both need to get better about, is drawing the distinction between illegal entry to this country through the back door versus legal entry to this country through the front door. In my view, is our great tradition in the United States of America is we want to be and have been a magnet for the brightest minds around the world. We're the championship team. We want the best and brightest to come, but who love this country enough to do it the right way through the front door. And I think that we're only going to have a sensible immigration policy if we're able to draw the distinction between border security, where if you entered this country illegally, I do believe that we're in the right to say that in a civilized, respectful, and humane way, we will return you to your country of origin, while also having a thoughtful approach to legal entry and legal migration into the United States, which has always been part of a tradition of what made this country great the first time. So thank you for the question. Go right here. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Vivek. As a Cuban immigrant myself, We waited 2.5 years before we came to this country legally. So I do agree with your views. You know,
And when did you come, if you may ask?
1971.
Great.
We came from Spain. One of the things that's interesting is I have a lot of family, Cuban family in Florida, the big population there. And so after the hurricane, we had many issues going on in our family with loss of power and so forth. So I try to see what's going on with policies that we have. When you had Mayorkas complaining that, and the Republicans that, they have to come back, Senator Speaker Johnson has to come back and, get the budget together, so we have no money for FEMA, right? Mm-hmm. So this obviously annoyed the heck out of me. So I started looking, and I looked at. I'm going to read off this if I don't mind. 1 second here. There were 60 Democrats who signed a letter urging Speaker Johnson to come do his job and bring the appropriations bill to fund FEMA. Right? All right. So Speaker Johnson responded by saying he had already passed appropriations bill funded FEMA with early drawdown authority. He also stated that FEMA is sitting on $22 billion, but yet only 1% was used for those people for the hurricane. So you go to, what am I referring to? Well, if you refer to, this is what you information, do research, right? You do your own research because the media will not tell you this, right? So I did some research. I looked it up. H.R. 8757, which was passed by Congress in June 28th of 2024, appropriated the $22 billion for FEMA. Now, the government, fiscal government comes in from October to September 30th, so October 1st to December 30th. So the hurricanes were declared to have emergency relief on October 1st. So they had funding available to them. But they want to play the semantics, right, of blaming the other side. Well, the Republicans passed that bill in 28 by 100 and, hold on, maybe a second. Wait a second here. By...
Well, I think the spirit of the question I take, and so I want to make sure I hit it head on, because I think your story also as a Cuban immigrant is something I'm very interested in. But tell me what you think I can address about the policy.
So the thing is this: we talk about misinformation and fact checking and so forth.
Yep.
We need to find reporting and mainstream media supposed to be the ones finding the facts and bringing that information to the public, and the public can make the decision. We're not, illiterate. We know if you bring it forward, we can make decisions ourselves.
Right. And I think the beautiful thing is there's still a positive silver lining to that story, is that now we have a free and open modern internet where you're able to actually do that, which wasn't possible as recently as 30, 40 years ago in this country. And some of this, I should say, is I fall into this trap at times too. We can blame the powers that be, but half the battle is that trick only works if we're buying what they're selling, right? If we're behaving or bending the knee to what they force upon us. And so half of this is, are we going to be victims or are we going to be victorious? Our founding fathers could have been victims of the British monarchy had they had their reasons to be, but they choose to be victorious instead. So does that impose some greater burden and responsibility on us? Yes, it does. But that's ultimately what the citizenry, in a certain sense, Thomas Jefferson famously said, the government we elect is the government we deserve. Well, that ultimately then falls on us not just to elect a different class of leaders, but to be skeptical of what we're force-fed, not just to swallow that like automatons, but to seek out truth even when that requires being skeptical of what the dominant narrative may be. And I admire you for embodying that, including in your question, my man. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Go right here.
My parents, just like yours, are legal immigrants who worked very, very hard and were finally able to buy a home and have their version of the American dream. Unfortunately, nowadays, it just costs way too much to buy a home. Mm-hmm. How do you hope the U.S. government goes about ensuring that home prices don't spike up even more and become more affordable and keep the American dream alive?
So it's a great question, and I understand the frustration of particularly your generation. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 17.
You're 17. Well, thank you for being here. Yeah, I appreciate that we're reaching younger Americans as well. Hard facts about the last few years. Prices have gone up. Wages effectively have not. And so no matter what economic figures the government might feed you to make you feel better about that, that is something that really leaves an entire generation jaded and skeptical about the American dream. That's your generation. Even my generation. I'm a millennial. I grew up into the 2008 financial crisis. Was 1 year after I got my first job in the financial sector in New York City in 2007. Not a great time to get a job in the financial arena.
But then you saw the bank bailouts that came afterwards. You were told that if you went to college and got a 4-year college degree back then, that somehow that was going to get you a head start in the American dream. A decade later, many of my classmates or contemporaries still had not paid off their college debts. So I think there's an understandable jadedness, particularly amongst millennials and especially about Gen Z, regarding the American dream. And I don't think it would land particularly well on you or your generation's ears if I just blithely came in here and told you the American dream is alive and well. As I was talking to a few of you beforehand, it's not alive and well. It is alive and hanging on for life support. So what do we do about this? Well, look, as it relates to housing costs, I think there's some tactical fixes. We've constrained the construction of new housing in this country through zoning restrictions, through housing supply constrictions. It's like the laws of supply and demand. If you limit the supply, prices go up. On the demand side, we have an artificial boost in demand from many illegals who have entered this country. Upwards of 8 figures of 10 plus, anywhere between 10 and 30 million illegal entrants to the country was not something that the market was prepared for on the demand side. But I think there's something more generally going on with respect to liberating our economy from the shackles of what we think of as the regulatory state in America. The regulatory state is part of what impedes the construction of new housing, but it's also what impedes innovation and economic growth in our country as well. And I think there's going to be a temptation, and this is a debate even in the future direction of the conservative movement. Do we want to get in there and use that regulatory state to advance right-wing or conservative ends? Or do we actually want to get in there and actually dismantle that regulatory state and shut it down? I come down on the latter side. I think that's what our founding fathers would say if they were here as well, is get in there, shut down that apparatus, allow American innovation and ingenuity to work, grow our economy so your generation does have an American dream that's alive and well again. So thank you, my man. I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a little nervous. I wanted to go back.
I love your outfit.
Thank you.
It's very patriotic.
Well, thank you. Okay, so I want to go back to the COVID issue.
Sure.
Okay. I was married for 30 years. We have 7 children. My husband worked at a company in West Caldwell. I live in West Orange. My name is Tammy Cowley. My husband's name was Brian. My husband was born with a hole in his heart, so he had a pre-existing condition. COVID did exactly what it was supposed to do. It took out the weak. My question to you, which my son, I want to go back. I'm lucky enough to have 2 children that attended this school.
Oh, great.
My daughter graduated in 2020. My son graduated in 2023. I now have a son who goes to the University of Michigan, and let me tell you, he's ready to vote there. He's a political science major, and he's one of the 10 students in the year 2022 to receive the Ronald Reagan Scholarship.
Wow. Congratulations to him.
I have a daughter who's attending Stockton, who was thinking of coming here, but she got a little nervous because her major is marine biology, so she went with Stockton. My heart's here, and I'm here. My heart's broken, and my question to you, I have a business card for you, too, from my son from Michigan. He wants to hand this to you.
Thank
but
you.
he couldn't fly home to see you, but he has seen you at Turning Point.
Thank you.
And all of those other things that go on. He's very active. Here's my question. And my husband's name was Brian. Okay. The last thing I did with my husband was vote in 2020 in October. My husband bought me this. And then he passed away, and from what happened when the country shut down. Do you, Civic, believe that China should be held accountable for the lives lost and the damages that have been done to families all over the world?
Well, thank you for your question and for your family's sacrifice. And your husband, Brian, is his name?
Yes.
He sounds like a great man, and my condolences for your loss to you and your 2 kids.
7.
7 kids, but your 2
7.
that you mentioned, 7 kids. He'd be hopefully will be proud of everything they go on to accomplish from a higher place. I'll tell you this is my impulse is, do we need accountability for the poor policy decisions that cause the loss of life? Yes, we do. And I think we need accountability on both sides. both on the China side of this, which lied about the origin of the pandemic.
And my husband wore his mask. He wore it.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
Well, and that's the problem, and that's the other side of the accountability is it's not just blaming somebody else, but we made our own fair share of bad policy decisions in this country too. And I think that it's hard to turn the page to the future without accountability for our past mistakes. But what I want from that accountability, moreover, is not just blame or retribution. It's accountability so we can learn and never make those same mistakes again. And as I said earlier, we would have gotten to those answers more quickly if we had been allowed to just freely have open dialogue about what was the origin of this pandemic, what should or shouldn't we be doing in response to it. And I think if we commit ourselves to at least say we can't change the past, Brian is not going to be able to come back in this life, but we can at least make sure that we learn from those mistakes for the future so your 7 children grow up in a country where we don't have the suppression of information flow or speech in the future, then at least may some good come out of a tragedy. And I think that that's the best we can do, is to learn from the future. But to answer your question, do I believe in accountability for China in particular? I was clear about this in my campaign. I do. Most importantly, because if we fail to hold China accountable, then I believe we can expect far worse in the future.
And my husband was a fan of yours.
Oh, tell him thank you, and I appreciate that, to Brian and your family. Thank you, please. We'll look for Austin, Michigan. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How's it going?
Hey.
I just wanted to say thank you again for coming out, talking to everyone here. It's a small community, but really appreciate it. And I just wanted to quickly preface
Sure.
on just myself, where I come from. And so I'm Peruvian, 22 years old. My name is Pablo Arias, first generation. Kind of just, kind of like your story. And it's interesting because I feel like, Gen Z, my generation, I feel like it's very divided. And when I grew up, being Latino, I was kind of fed the information, or just fed, the narrative that Democrats are for you, they're always going to be for you, and that's like the party that you should vote for when you get older. And it's interesting because as I got older, I started to kind of like fall into my passion, which is film. I work in the film industry, and it's interesting because it's a very artistic industry. There's a lot of artistic people, and I think what comes with that is very left-leaning and liberal people. And I have a bunch of friends that are Democrats, and I'm cool with them. It's it doesn't really matter to me, your political views. But I do find myself in situations nowadays where everything has become like a balancing act, and it's kind of why what your points that you made during your speech kind of stood out to me. And it's because we've gotten into an America where you can't say what you really want to say. You have to be holding yourself back. You have to kind of say what you think the people on the opposition can handle. And it's crazy because a lot of people that I work with don't really know this about me and really know my views, because if I were to say them, I might be blacklisted. So a lot of the points that you made today really stood out, and I think somebody like you and JD Vance, I think kind of shows what to me is the future of America and leaders in America. And my one question for you is, will you be considering another run for presidency in 2028?
Well, I appreciate that, man. What's your name?
Pablo.
I got one assignment for you first. Okay. When you are in that circle of friends or in a classroom or an interview context or whatever, when you're the only person in the room who believes what you do, I'm actually going to ask you to nonetheless take the risk and stand up and say it. Because that's what it's going to take to get this country back. Fear has been infectious. It has spread like COVID-19, like an infection across this country. But courage can be contagious too. It just requires more of us, frankly, more of your generation, standing up and actually willing to show it. So that's my ask of you. For our founding fathers at your age, probably, they were. At the time they founded this country, could make the sacrifices they did. I think we owe it to our country to make the sacrifice of courage today as well. And, I promise you this. I'll do whatever I believe my part is to have the biggest possible impact on our country. I'll tell you why I ran for president the first time. It's a very strange idea to have at the age of 37 without ever having held political office. You got to have a little bit, you got to have some screws loose somewhere to make sure that occurs to you as an idea. But any entrepreneur had to have some screws loose to start any business too. And I had done that a few times in my career. But I got a piece of advice when I was in my early 20s, which is that, and it's true, actually. If you just think about it, it just makes sense. It takes about as much effort to do something really small and to do it really well as it does to do something really big and to do it really well. So the conclusion I came to is, let me figure out what my gifts are. What am I good at? What am I not good at? There's more things on the latter list than the former list. That's probably true for most of us. But how am I going to use those God-given gifts to do the biggest possible thing that I can do in the short time that I've been given? And that's what led me to run for president last time around. And I will tell you, I will do whatever I feel my duty to this country is based on where we are 4 years from now. And it's my hope that 4 years from now, we're not going to be saying, make America great again. I hope 4 years from now, we're just going to be saying that America is great, and we just want to make America greater. Make it greater than it's ever been. And whatever way I can do that, I promise you I will. So thank you, man, for that question.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, so I know you talk a lot about being fearless, and that's a big factor here in America. So my question is, if you can give one piece of advice to the younger generation, what would it be?
I would say figure out where the pack is running and then find the conviction to take a different path and run the other way. Okay, you got to be contrarian, but you also have to be right. And that's a success lesson for politics, for business, whatever it is. Think about the world of investing. If you're buying a stock, and the same thing if you're starting an idea as a new entrepreneur, same principle applies. If you're buying a stock and the company's going to be really successful, well, great thesis, except everybody else thinks the same thing too, so you're paying a really high price to do it. Now, if you're buying stock and it's going to go to the toilet, well, you might be the only person doing it, but take the ride to the toilet along with you. Same thing as an entrepreneur starting a business concept that doesn't have legs. But if you know you're right, grounded in truth, and you're ahead of the pack or even go in a direction where you don't even know if the pack's going to follow you, that's really where the sky's the limit to you. Now, that's easier said than done. The temptation is most people, when they're following the pack, don't actually realize that they're following the pack. They think they're being really unique, when in fact they're really having the idea that occurred to everybody else at the same time. And so you got to really understand, if you're not encountering some real resistance on the path you're running on, the chances are you're actually following the pack without knowing it. But once you then discover that you're really alone in this, then just make sure you're actually right, all right? That you have the conviction that regardless of whether somebody's following you or not, you know your destination's worth pursuing. Be that a business, be that a book you want to write, be that a stock you want to buy, be that a political ideology you want to represent. But if you're both contrarian and you're right, then the sky is the limit for what you can achieve. And that's the best advice I could give you, my man. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Allow me to quickly introduce myself. My name is Thomas Gaida. I'm a student at Montclair State University, pretty close to here. And I'm majoring in environmental and earth sciences. And I'm sure just from that you can gather that you and I would have a lot that we disagree on. But nonetheless...
Not necessarily, but perhaps we do.
Perhaps. Nonetheless, I want to say I have the utmost respect for you and for the fact that you have a passion for just simple, fearless, and civil conversation. Because as an enthusiastic debater myself, I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you, man.
Specifically in our country, I think that's a very important thing regarding politics and really any matter. But now I'll go on to ask, because just yesterday, actually, I watched your discussion that was within the past couple months with Mark Cuban. And you quite passionately disagreed with his idea of DEI. Now, if you wouldn't mind, just for the sake of the audience and of the clarity of your answer, can you give a definition of DEI and also maybe provide us with what you would do either to change it, replace it, or would you just remove it?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. So DEI as conceived versus the underlying words may mean something very different, but what it's come to mean is capital D, capital E, capital I stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what that effectively entails is particularly the equity prong, the E prong, is the idea that different demographic groups have to have equal results and equal representation in different organizations, and that's what that organization's diversity is really all about. I reject this vision. I think the best person should get the job regardless of their skin color. I believe in merit. I think merit and group quotas are incompatible. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both at the same time. Either you believe in group quotas or you believe in merit. You can't have both. And I think part of what's happened is that the DEI agenda, taken the further step, says not only is it the job to provide proportional group representation in the hiring of an organization, but there are certain ideas which are inherently offensive to or could be offensive to members of minority groups in that organization, and therefore those ideas can't be expressed. You've seen good examples of this. I'll give you probably the most salient example was the case of a woman who had Red Sweater Fridays in her workplace to honor military veterans. I think it was a son or a family member of hers who was a veteran. There was a member of a minority group that found this to be a microaggression, reported this to Human Resources, who then asked her not to actually have Veteran Fridays, Red Sweater Fridays anymore, which they ceased, after which she still continued bringing her red sweater, hung it on the back of her seat, after which HR still told her that was a little bit too much and crossing the line. So what have we accomplished in that process? In the name of diversity, we've sacrificed true diversity of thought. In the name of equity, we've sacrificed true equality of opportunity. In the name of inclusion, we've created a new culture of exclusion where certain viewpoints just aren't welcome. So I'm not a big fan of three-letter acronyms anyway, but if you had to make one, I would propose, I don't know, EOC, excellence, opportunity, civility. I like those things. I think they make sense for an organization. But I don't think we should be using these three-letter acronyms at all, because true diversity is guided by purpose. I talked about this at the level of the individual, but I could talk about it at the level of an organization. Every organization has its own unique purpose. And out of that purpose falls a need for diversity, different kinds of diversity in different organizations. You may need humanities majors. You may need math majors. You may need computer science trained individuals. And different organizations need different kinds of diversity to make themselves stronger, but that's not the same kind of diversity in each organization. That's my view, is that diversity should fall out of organizational purpose rather than a one-size-fits-all packaged into three-letter acronyms that are supposed to be universally used by all organizations. And I think that's where Mark Cuban, who has become something of a friendly sparring partner of mine, even after that podcast, we spar on text message exchanges all the time. I think that's where he and I have different points of view, but I also think it's a beautiful thing that he and I are able to have spirited discussions without still regarding one another as each other's enemy over it. Absolutely. And I do think that that is part of how we embrace the true diversity in the marketplace of ideas that actually makes our country stronger. So thank you, man. I appreciate the question. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm only 14 right now. I'm a sophomore in high school.
Nice. I'm glad you're here. Wait, so don't you have class?
I sit for this.
Truancy. Oh, we better make this good and make sure you get your education, your educational day out of this.
So obviously I'm below the voting age, but what's something that right now I could do to help out with the conservative movement going on right now?
Well, I think you're already doing it by keeping an open mind, my man. I think that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
So I would normally caution people in general not to get too wrapped up in the machinery of politics, but in the final lead up to an election, there actually is just a really cool process to learn about the way we conduct this beautiful thing called elections. So we got about 25 days, something like that, between now and November 5th, less than 25 days. What you have a chance to do is get involved with your local, if it's a conservative movement, the local chapter, the GOP, knock doors. I think voter registration, I don't know when it ends in New Jersey. It ends in other states relatively soon. It ended yesterday. Okay, so not that opportunity quite in New Jersey, but even knocking doors, spreading messages, having conversations with neighbors. That's a beautiful thing. That's really what the true lifeblood of democracy is all about. So I'd say find your local GOP county office. Tell them how they could put you to work, not in just sort of some sort of activity you're not going to learn from, but either working phone banks or knocking doors. Don't do that for 6 months, but do it for about 20, 25 days, and I think you'll learn a tremendous amount about how actual democracy works. And then do what you're doing now. Stay curious. If you think you're going to learn or hear a perspective that you otherwise wouldn't gain, have the initiative to show up, stand in line, wait at a microphone, and ask a question at the age of 14 in front of several hundred people. That takes a lot of guts for a 14-year-old, so I'm proud of you, man. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Time for the last two questions.
Hi, Vivek.
Hey.
Okay. Hey, my name is Manan Shukla. I'm from Robbinsville, New Jersey, so the trek up here was like an hour, 30 minutes. First
Thank
of
you.
all, I'm glad that you didn't change your name when you ran for president. It meant a lot to me when you started running. My question is that as I'm 20 years old, I'm pretty much the only one in my circle that really cares about politics or policy. And I think the reason is that we're tired of the culture war topics and the culture war talking points. I think that among at least my group, which admittedly is upper middle class, I think that we recognize that most of our priorities and most of our grievances are economic and more policy decisions and not things about transgenderism or sports or anything like that. I think those are buzzwords and distractions, and most of my friends think the same. So my question to you is, what do you think about that, and why do you think the political machine talks it up so much? Why do you think that that's at the center of our conversation?
Yeah, so I'd say a couple things. I think it's a very fair question in framing, and I would love for that to be true. I think in the same way I would tell you, you may not care about politics, but politics cares about you, often for the worse. I'd say a version of that's probably true about the culture war, too, which is that you may not care about the culture war, but in its fiercest form, unfortunately, the culture war still cares about you. That is to say that if you can't get a spot in college because of your ethnicity, that affects your economic prospects. And that's a palpable reality for a lot of people out there. Now, that gets into discussions about wokeism, which gets categorized as a culture war topic. Well, it matters, because if you got a 1,500 on your SAT and did your extracurriculars and had a decent GPA, but you can't get into the college of your choice, that is a culture war topic that has found its way to you. If you're a young woman who has aspired for your entire middle school and high school career to be a successful swimmer, worked hard, that was your goal, to win the gold medal at the local competition, and then somebody snatches it from you at the very end because it was a biological man who had swum for 3 years in men's swimming competitions but then decided in his senior year to qualify as a woman, that affects you and what you're actually able to achieve in your sense of self-worth and pride. And so my view is we should never be in the business of chasing divisive culture war topics for the sake of chasing them, but to regard and restore a respect for true individual dignity, to say that every one of us is different. You're free to achieve whatever you want to achieve without anybody standing in your way. But if there's a system that stands in your way, we're not just going to allow our own way of life and institutions to be steamrolled, because that also impedes our economic progress and self-determination. And so where I draw the line is I'm not looking for the culture war, but where the culture war finds me or the people who comprise our country, we're going to hold firm to stand for the actual ideals that made our country great the first time. And here's where I know we can use the litmus test as a conservative response to this, certainly. The more we're talking about the other side and cultural poison, the more we're probably off the mark. The more we're talking about our own value set and what we're going to defend to the very end and stand for, the closer we are to the mark. Right? Individual, family, nation, and God beats race, gender, sexuality, and climate. But sometimes we may fall into the trap about talking too much about race, gender, sexuality, and climate, and maybe not enough about individual, family, nation, and God. And I don't view that as a cultural war. I view that as part of a positive cultural revival that I do think is important for the broader economic revival that we need in our country as well. So that's where I land on it. But thank you, man. I appreciate the question.
Vivek.
Thank you. Thank you.
Glad I get the last question.
Sure.
1973 graduate of Caldwell College for Women. Huge supporter over the years in promoting the college, supporting it in any way I can, including financially. I am probably one of the few people here today who was very upset by the fact that you are the launch speaker because of its proximity to the election and because we have many impressionable, young, diverse people here at Caldwell University. I haven't gotten that through yet. And my question to you, and I follow you on X, I have read a lot of your work. I have done my research before I came here. You talk well. You're an eloquent speaker. Why, in God's name, if character is important to you, do you support Trump?
Hey, no booing, no booing, no booing. Hey, listen. So I want to say a few things. I think that the first thing is to somebody who clearly cares about this institution and this university. I thank you for caring enough to be philanthropic to a mission that you want to clearly have outlive yourself and your experience here. I think it's an admirable thing, and I think one of my goals today, though you may have noted an objection to having a perceived political figure as the first inaugural speaker of the speaker series, one of the things that I was committed to doing today was actually not to bring partisan politics into this discussion, which I haven't been. I hope I've been faithful to that without talking about individual political candidates. However, I'm also committed to transparently answering questions that are asked of me. So I'm going to answer your question now without casting a political lens on what I think is a discussion that's far deeper about the future direction of our country and the next generation. So here's my view. You may not agree with 100% of what Donald Trump says. Based on your question, I suspect you don't. And by the way, I ran for president against him. Neither do I. He and I, and we know this, have our differences in opinion as well. I was in an event over the weekend with Tulsi Gabbard, with RFK, with Ben Carson, a man who I deeply respect. Actually, he was one of the people who my wife met long before she went to med school, and she took inspiration from his story before she went on to become a surgeon herself. All four of us don't agree with each other on 100% of topics, and that includes if we put Donald Trump in the group of the five of us. We've all run against each other as U.S. president and disagree. But what we do agree on is the idea that we ought to be proud of who we are as a people, and that we've lost that sense of pride as a country, that we've lost the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are, and this may be controversial to say, but I'll say it because I think it's true, we are the greatest nation known to the history of mankind because of the ideals that set the country into motion in 1776. And for too long, we've taught ourselves to flog ourselves and apologize for who we are and our way of life, and to allow other countries around the world to not only look down on us, but laugh at us as they took advantage of us economically and otherwise at other steps of the way. That we've had foreign wars in the last 20 years that haven't really benefited my generation, who fought in many of those wars and bears the national debt that comes out of it, and recognizes the need for a new way forward in our country. Now, in our family, we have an expression we teach our kids, and I think I still stand by it today, and I try to practice what I preach as well. Sometimes you got to be strong enough to protect your kindness, okay? And when you're fighting against tough opponents, that requires the mentality of saying, if you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you back 10 times harder. And that isn't always pretty. That doesn't always come out with the right formulation of a tweet or a social media post. And you're allowed to have differences of opinion with respect to what you think the style is of what you want out of a U.S. president or an elected leader. But the reason, after I ran against Donald Trump, my reason to support him nonetheless was really simple when it came down to who do I think for my kids is going to create an economy that allows them to live the same American dream that I did without constraints based on their race or their gender or their skin color. Who do I think is going to keep us out of World War III? Who do I think is going to seal the border to illegal immigrants entering the country? And most importantly, who's going to make my kids more proud to be American without apologizing for it? And that's where I landed where I did. But the beauty of our country is you don't have to agree with me. And we actually settle this through a beautiful process every 4 years at the presidential level, every year in other elected office, where every citizen's voice and vote counts equally at the ballot box. That's what made this country great the first time around. And the principle I raised in the non-political portion of my speech, I only got political because you asked me to, but even in the non-political portion of the speech is, at least we need a country where the people we elect to run the government, whether it's the people you agree with or the people I agree with, let them be the ones who actually run the government, not millions of unelected federal bureaucrats who are really the ones who are making federal policy today anyway. That's why we fought an American Revolution. is this idea. It was a crazy idea. I'll close on this because it's a great question to close on, and I could be here all day with you guys. I'm having too much fun here, but we got to come back to Caldwell, Beverly, if you'll have me back. Bring some Democrats too, by the way. We got to even diverse points of view. I'm all in favor of you bringing some prominent Democrats out here. You got a few of those in New Jersey and New York. They're not far away, so you shouldn't have trouble finding them. I came all the way here from Ohio, so it should be a doable thing. And by the next time I come here, I better have heard some people who disagree with me who came here in between too. But that's really what made this country great the first time around, is that we were the pioneers, the unafraid, the explorers, the people who weren't afraid of being challenged and could hold our own in response. People who had this wild idea that we, the people, could create a government that was actually accountable to us instead of the other way around. That the people we elect to run the government are the ones who run the government. That you get to express your opinion, no matter how wild or crazy it is. That you get to do that in the United States. That was crazy talk in old world Europe. Right, from Henry VI to King George II to most of the old world to most of human history, it was actually done the other way. The idea that you could self-govern and express yourself, that was the stuff of crazy talk. And that's what made America great the first time around. And so when I hear certain political figures use the word weird as an epithet to say that, oh, there's 70 million people in the country and they're just plain weird, I look at it totally differently. I don't want the response to that saying, no, you're the weird ones, not me. No, actually, I kind of look at it totally differently. America is kind of weird, actually. Over the course of human history and on God's green earth, this is a pretty weird, in the best of ways, unique nation in human history. A nation built not on a genetic identity, a nation not built on a common bloodline or genetic stock or some food or even a religion, but a nation built on a set of ideals that brought together a divided polyglot group of people 250 years ago. And even to tie it to the prior question about DEI, part of what happened in this country is, I grew up into this generation. We were taught to celebrate our diversity and our differences so much that we actually forgot all of the ways that we are really the same as Americans. It's on the bottom of our coins, e pluribus unum. It means something. It means from many, one. That is what won us the American Revolution. That is what reunited us after the Civil War. That is what won us 2 world wars in the Cold War. That is what still gives hope to the entire free world. And if we can revive that dream over group identity and victimhood and grievance, and for that matter, political partisanship, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus, not China, is going to defeat us. And that is what American exceptionalism is all about. And that is what I believe we will revive if we can pass on that dream to our kids and their generation. So may God bless you and your families. And I want to thank Caldwell for having me. I promise you we'll come back. Keep fighting for the future of our country and our children. And take care, and may our best days be ahead of us. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.